thank you all so much for being here. You know, this is such an exciting time and place to talk about Paralympic sport. First of all, it's an exciting time because we just came out of Rio, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that. This is a really exciting place to talk about adapted sport, too, because of the University of Alabama's leadership in adapted sport. It's really terrific. I mean, Alabama in many ways has set the standard for competitive, elite, adapted sport in the U.S. Penn State certainly aspires, our program aspires to be the kind of program that my friend and colleague Brent Hardin has launched here and led for many years at Alabama. So I want to plug an event that I found out about because I do follow the adapted sport program on Facebook, and I think this is a pretty cool event. This documentary that's going to be aired or is going to be shown next week. If you could make it, I would suggest you do. So there's my plug for Alabama. I think has an absolutely terrific program. So my research has been on the interaction of bodies with sport as we define and idealize it. And in that capacity, I've really spent a lot of time looking at women and at athletes with a disability. And certainly that involves a lot of Paralympic athletes. And those Paralympic athletes, again, a lot of those come from right here at the University of Alabama. And many of those athletes, those Paralympic athletes, were, of course, in Rio. And this is a picture of the closing ceremonies in Rio. This was taken by one of our students at Penn State who was on that trip. Of course, the Olympics take place in these venues, and the Paralympics also take place in the same venues as the Olympics. Now, you may not know much about the Paralympics, so I'm going to spend some time telling you about those, and then we're going to move on to talking about some big ideas that I want to kind of get you thinking about in relationship to how we cover Paralympic and elite adapted sport. Does anyone know where the Paralympics or what year the first Paralympics took place? Do we have anybody who is a historian of the Paralympics or knows much about it? 1960 in Rome. So we don't have, Paralympics don't quite have the same history in terms of longevity as the Olympics. This year in Rio, we had athletes from 157 countries represented. That was about 4,000 athletes, and a dramatic increase this year in the number of women who participated. Now, based on the number of athletes and countries who participate in the Paralympics, it's the second largest global sporting event in the world. What do you think is the largest? What do you think is the largest? I like participation, especially since most of you are undergrads.
The actual Olympics?
Yeah, very good. The actual Olympics are the largest. By number of athletes, the Paralympics are the second largest. Now, as Andy said, I was there with a group of students from UGA and Penn State, and we were producing stories for the Associated Press. This is what I would call a highly, and I can talk more about this later, but this was a highly successful experiment. And there are two things that I can certainly talk about later. I'm not going to spend time during my talk. The first one is this illuminated for me the power of sports department culture to preserve, essentially to preserve norms and values that lock out Paralympic sport from real coverage. I'm certain that some of you in here are interested in ultimately becoming sports journalists. And if you're not thinking about the norms and values in sports departments, this is certainly eye-opening in terms of my thinking about it. Another thing it did was it illuminated incremental ways to improve exposure. This grand experiment that we undertook really showed me some ways that we can increase incrementally exposure and cultural understanding and support for Paralympic athletes. Now today, what I'm not going to do is spend a lot of time talking about concepts in Paralympic sport and adapted sport that perhaps you've heard, the idea of the super Crip, the idea of awareness and coverage of Paralympic sport in sort of a blame the media kind of way, because we've heard all that before. So what I want to do instead is talk to you based on the idea that media reflect culture. So it's not us and them. Have you ever heard of the media talked about like the media, are doing really bad stuff and we, the good citizens, don't like it? I'm going to talk to you about from the perspective that essentially the media reflect us. So when I talk about problems in Paralympic culture, I'm really going to talk about culture and how we participate in that. So more about the Paralympics themselves, more pictures for you here. In Rio, attendance, so spectators who attended, it was about 2.15 million. That's a little less than we had in London. London was in 2012, was really a high watermark for the Paralympics. In terms of attendance, the Paralympics are the third largest global sporting event in the world. So number one is the Olympics in terms of attendance. What do you think number two is in terms of number of spectators who show up at a global sporting event? Nope, that's a big one in the U.S. Global.
FIFA?
Yeah, World Cup. Yep, World Cup is number two. But still, the Paralympics, number three in attendance. Again, another photo from one of our students. More information just as a background on the Paralympics. 22 sports, including one in new sports, canoe and triathlon, and an alumnus of Alabama participated in the canoeing. Most sports in the Paralympics are adapted from able-bodied sports events, okay? And these are really high levels of competition. I'm going to give you an example. This year, in the men's 1,500 meter, in the Paralympics, there were 4 finishers who crossed the line in faster times than the gold medalist in the Olympics, okay? So these are elite athletes. Another example, the most accurate shooter in the history of archery is a Paralympian, okay? So I want to give you a sense of the levels of competition we're talking about there. And of course the USA was there with a gold medal women's basketball team that did include Alabama athletes. Let me ask you all this. Got you here. How much did you see about the Paralympics on television? Anybody?
I saw a lot of it on social media, but not really on television.
Okay. Anybody else? Did any of you watch it on TV? Did you see much on TV at all? Okay. Did you see the Olympics on TV? Big contrast, right? Okay. So do you think awareness was very high of the Paris? Not really, probably. I mean, I probably told you things about the Paralympics you didn't know already, right? Okay. So you probably don't know who this is, the woman in the blue with her hand up. She's winning there. Does anyone know who that is? She's probably, Brent, in my mind, she's the most famous U.S. Paralympian. Tatiana McFadden. She's a winner of 4 gold medals. And again, she's probably got more gold medals in her history of Paralympic participation than some more familiar Olympic names that you know about. So how do you think the U.S. does in terms of medaling at the Paralympics? How do you think we did at the Olympics? Let me start with that. How do you think we did at the Olympics?
Pretty well.
Say that again?
Pretty well.
Pretty well. What does that mean to you? What would be pretty well?
I don't know if it's American Bride, but hopefully we're on top.
Okay, hopefully we're on top, right?
We were first in medal count.
Okay, first in medal count. There you go. That's how we did. Okay? U.S. was first, then Great Britain, China, Russia, and Germany. All right? How do you think we did in the Paralympics?
Once again, hopefully on top.
Hopefully on top. Anybody know? There's how we did in the Paralympics. Not as good, right? Not as good. You can see that we tied for third. And in 2012, I'm not even sure we were in the top 3. In fact, I don't even think we were in the top 5 in 2012. Now, we were number 1 for many years, till the mid-1990s, and then we really fell off in terms of being top in the world in the Paralympics. Just something I want to point out to you here. China and Great Britain, who have done very, very well in the past few Paralympics, what do you think might be a factor for how well they've done? Okay, media exposure. We're going to talk about the relationship between media exposure and medal count. But where were the Olympics in 2008 when you were like 10 years old?
Beijing.
I'm sorry, where were they?
Beijing.
They were in Beijing. They were in China. Okay? And where were the Olympics in 2012? In London, right? So you can see there is a relationship, at least for the Paralympics, not so much with the Olympics, but with the Paralympics, there is a relationship between awareness, when you have the event in your country, the awareness goes way up, and we've seen China and Great Britain really rise up in the medal count, and a lot of that has to do with really their location of the Olympics, okay? Let's talk about the UK for just a minute, and you saw how well they've done in the past couple of Paralympics, and I talked about location. The Paralympic coverage is prominent. And Andy, your research shows us that there is a relationship between medal count and coverage, right? Yes. Yeah. So there is a relationship. That's part of it. That's part of the reason that we saw in 2016 so much coverage of the Paralympics in places like the BBC, the Daily Mail, and the Guardian. There's also coverage. There was also coverage through a regular program called We're the Superhumans, and you can go on YouTube and watch parts of this. A very popular show in the UK, especially among millennials. And globally, I just want to talk for a minute about global coverage. There were 157 countries that participated. 154 had media representation at the games. They were the most broadcast in history. And this is interesting. Most broadcasters made a point of bringing somebody on their team who had a disability themselves, which I think is important. So that was key. And then we had more rights holders than ever in terms of airing the Paralympics. What do you who is the rights holder for the U.S. for the Olympics? NBC, right? NBC is the rights holder. It's also the rights holder for the Paralympics, okay? And this year, for the first time, the NBC really ramped up its coverage of the Paralympics. You could get the coverage on the app, you could get it online streaming, and you could, if you were willing to go way down on your cable listings. You know, if you have the cable listings, you get down to about channel, 200, 250, right? NBC has some sports channels. And if you were willing to go there during certain parts of the day, you could see some Paralympics. But there is still a big difference between the way the U.S. airs and covers the Paralympics, media in the U.S. and media in other countries. And I want to put some big ideas in your head about why that might be, okay? The U.S. for the Olympics, just to give you a sense about this, there were more than 400 journalists from the U.S. who went to the Olympics in Rio. What do you think it was for the Paralympics from the U.S.? Any guesses? We sent 400 for the Olympics.
Maybe half that.
Maybe half that. 200?
40.
40, okay. You want to play the higher lower game here? I would go lower, lower. It was 29, okay? 29 compared to 400. And most of those were for specialty websites or advocacy groups. So they weren't journalists working for big news organizations, okay? So much, much smaller number. Now, let's compare this to other countries. Britain, 59. Germany, and these are much smaller countries, many fewer media outlets. Germany, 99. Japan, these are just a few of them for you. Japan, 122. Why do you think Japan would send so many? I'm asking you because most of you are comm students, right? So I want you to be thinking about these kinds of things. Why do you think Japan would send so many? Where's the next Olympics and Paralympics?
Tokyo.
Yeah, it's in Tokyo, okay? So you're always going to see that country who's got the next version of the games. They're going to be sending a lot more journalists to start that buzz and start those journalists acclimating to covering, okay? Now, the numbers I just gave you, you can see there's a big difference between what the U.S. does on the paras and what other countries relatively do with the paras, okay? And that leads to questions that we need to answer. These are questions that came out in other media coverage around the globe. There you go, from the Independent in the UK. Does America have a problem with the Paralympics? The questions about why we don't nominate the Paralympics. And then that last headline was from the Christian Science Monitor, simply asking, how can we get people more interested in the Paralympics? And again, U.S. participation in and cultural awareness of and investment in the Paralympics, those two things are related. Leads us to the question, why? Why do you think the U.S. the media doesn't cover it as much. And we don't do quite as well in the paras competitively. Any ideas? Cultural stigmas, okay. Interesting. Anybody else? We're going to talk about culture and cultural dimensions. Any other ideas here? This is what I'm going to put out there, and Brent, I want to see what you think of this. At the end of the day, resources, right? Now, resources reflect our cultural ideas, our cultural identity, all right? But we can go back right away to resources. A gold medalist at the Olympics gets $25,000. A gold medalist at the Paralympics, $5,000. Okay. Another example, there's very little to no federal funding for Paralympians and sponsorships. Now that's also true for Olympians, but sponsorships, which are really the way that athletes can make a living and train, those sponsorships for many, many reasons aren't available to Paralympians the same way that they're available to Olympians. So why don't we, as a culture, invest more? And this gets back to what you were getting to about culture, which I think is really terrific that you are already going there. So again, I don't want us to blame the media, because I don't think that's where, I think at the end of the day, that's not a terribly useful answer for us. Instead, I want us to think about our cultural identity and how that interacts with the media, okay? So again, I would argue that it's cultural. Now, I'm going to use the work here of a researcher named Geert Hofstede. And maybe you've heard of him in a theory class, maybe not. We tend not to use him so much in media studies, but I just want you to know who he is. He has a very large body of work that's been influential across a number of fields, and it's not without its detractors, and I'm not going to get into all of that, but he essentially has 6 dimensions of cultural identity that he uses to sort of tell us what the differences are among nations in culture, okay? I'm interested in a couple of those dimensions, and I want us to just think about ultimately about how those might affect Paralympic coverage, okay? And the 2 dimensions are masculine, feminine, which you may not think about when we think about Paralympic coverage and Paralympics, and individual collective. Masculine, feminine, and individual collective, he says the U.S. has an identity, a unique identity in both of those areas and more, okay? So I guess my question for you is, first, let's talk about masculine and feminine. When we hear masculinity, give me just a few identifiers. When you hear the word masculinity, what adjectives come to mind? What descriptors come to mind? You didn't think you were going to have to participate, did you? What adjectives come to mind?
Strong.
Strong, okay. I'll take it.
Tenacity.
Strong tenacity, okay. I'll take them. Feminine. Feminine. This isn't hard. Feminine. What do you think? What comes to mind? Anything? Say it again?
Caring.
Caring, okay. Give me one more.
Nurturing.
Nurturing, thank you. Okay. All right, caring and nurturing. All right, good. Now, when Hofstede thinks about masculine and feminine, those are perfect, by the way. Thank you. Those were perfect, and I think we could develop a longer list even than those. But Hofstede really, the way he just defined a masculine culture and a feminine culture is he said a masculine culture sort of has different roles and different social expectations for women and men, and a culture that's more feminine really does not have clearly defined roles, and there's a lot of overlap in social expectations of women and men. Where do you think we fit here? Where do you think lots and lots of survey data would tell us the U.S. fits? What part of the spectrum do you think? Ideas?
I don't want to say dead center, but I would say a little bit to the left of masculine.
Okay, good, yes. Actually, we're pretty far over, though. We're pretty far over. based on lots and lots of survey data. Now, how does this overlap with our understanding of sports? I think we have some really strong distinctions and expectations around masculinity and femininity in sports, and I want to kind of draw this in for you. Who's that? Usain Bolt. We all know who Usain Bolt is. He exemplifies, I think, masculine gender performance and body, right? So strength, I think somebody said that earlier, speed and power. Would anybody disagree with me on those three? And would we agree that strength, speed, and power, if we put them on a continuum between masculine and feminine, we'd really, if you ask people, they'd probably put those pretty far over on the masculine continuum, okay? And he's gotten a great deal of favorable media coverage, a great deal of coverage. He fits the ideal. All right, here's another one. You know who he is? Of course we do, right? Michael Phelps, okay? So again, ideal American athlete, strength, speed, and power. There's no ambiguity here. A great deal of positive media coverage, okay? All right, let me ask you this, though. Who's that? Does anybody know? Andy, do you know? Yeah. She's a gold medalist in London and in Rio for boxing. She's a gold medalist for boxing. Her name is Clarissa Shields. Obviously, she's a woman. You can see that. Do you think she lines up with our cultural expectations of femininity? Not at all. I mean, right? This is an easy one. Not at all. Even though she was a gold medalist for us, and the first female gold medalist we had in boxing, and what I would argue is the reason you didn't see her at all in London, I mean, NBC didn't show her at all, even though she was winning the gold for us, and we got very little coverage of her in Rio, very little coverage, is because she doesn't line up with our expectations about masculinity and femininity. And the point I'm trying to make here is, in sports, bodies that don't line up with our expectations of sort of the idealized masculine body, because we define sports so much as masculine or feminine body, we're really not going to see those folks very much, because there's a kind of what I call cognitive dissonance here, and you've probably heard that term at some point in college, cognitive dissonance, where we've got to struggle a little bit with our cultural expectations and what we're seeing, okay? All right, let's get to the other dimension that I mentioned earlier. Individualism and collectivism there, okay? Now, individualism, I'll just tell you how Hofstede defined that. The ties between individuals are loose, and everybody's expected to look after him or herself and their immediate family. Collectivism, the automatic integration of people into cohesive groups, really from birth. They've got cohesive in-groups that offer protection in exchange for high degrees of loyalty. Where do you think we are here? Are we highly collectivist or individual as a culture, do you think? According to lots and lots of data that Hofstede's collected over many decades. Where would you put us? Somebody made a pretty good guess on gender earlier.
I think we want to be collective, but we're actually more individual.
Yeah, absolutely. Very good. In fact, Hofstede ranks us as the most individual country on earth. I mean, we are uniquely individualist. In fact, the word independent may be the word that most strongly describes the cultural ethos for Americans, according to the research that Hofstede has done. Now, let me give you just one example to kind of tie this in to how it fits with the way we think about and treat adapted and Paralympic sport, okay? And that is our media systems. And maybe some of you have had a class where you've looked at comparative media systems. Think about public funding or funding for public media, okay? That might be, I think it is, a reflection of our individual or collective identity as a nation, all right? They're essentially, and I'm boiling this way down because you can take a whole course on this kind of thing. Essentially, you can look at the way countries, nations fund their media as dual, mixed, or minimalist, all right? And I didn't make these terms up. They came from another source, okay? There's public media. What's an example of public media? You've got one here on campus. Example of public media. It's in that really cool digital media facility, right, Jennifer?
Very cool.
Yeah, it's very cool.
WVUA 23.
Say that again?
WVUA 23.
WVUA 23. That is,
That's a commercial.
that's private. I'm actually going to get, that's one type. I'm glad you brought that up because that's private media. Okay, so it's privately, commercially owned. What's an example of what we'd call public media?
Alabama Public Radio.
Alabama Public Radio, great example, okay? So there's a difference there between those kinds of media, okay, in the way that one is commercial-free, right? You don't hear commercials on Alabama Public Radio, I don't think, right? But you're going to get commercials on 23, all right? So you have two basic types of media, and you also have direct and indirect ways of funding those media, okay? So dual would be where a nation really puts money, public money, into both types of media and does it directly and indirectly. Mixed means varying levels of support, and minimalist, very low levels for all, okay? Let me give you dollars to kind of illustrate what I'm talking about with the U.S. and individual culture and the way it kind of relates to this. Remember Germany? Germany came up earlier. It was, we saw that, I told you about the number of journalists who were covering the Paralympics, and Germany also was 5th in the medal count at the Paralympics, so it did pretty well there. Germany spends $130 per capita funding public and private media, okay? It really is a dual source there. The UK, again, has done very well with coverage of the Paralympics and with its performance in the Paralympics, $90 per capita. Japan, Canada, and Australia are in the $30 to $40 range. Now remember what I said about the U.S., and research shows us that we're highly individualist. How much money do you think the U.S. spends per capita funding public and private media? If I told you the high is 130, what do you think the U.S. is? Take a guess. You got nothing to lose.
$7.
$7. I'm going to tell you to go lower,
$2.
higher. $4. You're close. If I had a prize, I'd give it to you. Just $4. All right. So there's an example when we think about individualists and collectivists and how that ultimately, the media systems are just one example of how that might ultimately impact our coverage of Paralympic sport. So where does that leave us? I talked about collective and individual. I talked about masculine and feminine. And you can see there where the U.S. falls, and in sport, that really narrows the kinds of bodies, essentially, that we want to idealize and make visible. And what I want you to understand is that dimensions of cultural identity are really a big deal. They're not a small thing. If you think just about gender and all of the things around our cultural practices about gender, why you're wearing what you're wearing, for instance, today, right? All the cultural practices, gender is it's not a small thing, and we really have a gender binary in the U.S. And I'm not saying that it's not elsewhere, but certainly in the U.S., and there's certain kinds of bodies that are idealized in sport. And we have a premium on individualism, and that also, we see that reflected in sport, okay? In sport, culture, and in media. So when we think about the coverage of the Paralympics and the way adapted sport athletes are covered, really, until these two big things, till we see shifts, really big shifts in these areas in our cultural identity, we're really just going to see, it's going to be positive because we have seen positive progress, more coverage on NBC than we've had in previous years, but it's going to be incremental. Now, I mentioned we have seen progress, okay, and we will continue to, which is terrific. But, and I think we are starting to see some cracks in these two areas. So let me give you some easy and quick examples here. We know who she is, Caitlyn Jenner, and anything you happen to think about Caitlyn Jenner, we do know this, that the conversations that take place around gender show us that things are much more fluid now than in previous years. So just the conversations around Caitlyn Jenner, I think, have done that. Do you know who this is? Who is it?
Didn't she compete in the opposite race that she is now, or the opposite gender?
She did not. You're talking, nope, she didn't.
She was born with the male parts.
This is Castor Semenya, and she has higher natural levels of testosterone. And there was a lot of controversy around her in terms of competing in the Olympics, but she was able to compete as a woman in the Olympics. So again, we're seeing some fluidity around gender that I think is ultimately very positive, okay? And this is another image that I want to show you, that just to help you understand that these things can and do change over time, right? There was a time when men wore heels and wigs and essentially dresses, okay? So gender does change over time, and I just like to use this as an example to get you thinking that the way things are today aren't the way that they're always going to be, okay? So, can our cultural definitions of sport change enough to absorb this to the point where, as a culture, we see it, we embrace it, and we understand it as a kind of sport that we demand media provide for us to consume? And I would say that we're moving there slowly. Over time, as culture changes, we'll move there much more quickly. So I feel very good about the future of Paralympic sport. And that's it. Thank you for participating.
All right, folks, we're now open for questions from the audience.
Any questions for me on anything? I covered some big ideas. Yes?
Have you seen the Paralympic commercial? There's one actually they had, I forget what it was ad for. It was, I think, it like a candy bar or something.
That's really, I think, a good sign of progress, because we have seen some Paralympics integrated into sponsorship ads and commercials, especially around the Olympics and Paralympics, and it's been a very, very good thing. Yeah.
Really humanizes it.
Yep, absolutely. Brent, do you know who that was? The Paralympian, or the Paralympians who've gotten those kind of commercial?
Yeah, there's actually a lot more. You're right, there's a lot more. That's something that we've been tracking, is the sponsorships. And Toyota has been huge. Hilton has taken on a lot of sponsors, BP. Those are some of the really big ones. There was a good commercial by Guinness beer, some of you may have seen. Those things are really encouraging.
And they're important.
Yeah,
They're really, really important.
because They send a message that companies start to value athletes with disabilities in a different way. It changes their expectations.
Yeah. It's exciting because, again, it's that evolution that we're seeing. What else? Other questions that you have? Yeah.
I'm from China.
Uh-huh.
Even in the Paralympics, China won a lot of medals.
Yes.
The number one. But I barely see any coverage about Paralympics too. I think it's absolutely matters about money, but sometimes I think it's about the people's psychology.
Yes.
People that see disabled people compete make people feel kind of upset. I think that is one barrier.
Yep. I would agree entirely with that. There's a kind of a cognitive dissonance that we have to struggle with, and it depends on the kind of cultural dimensions that are at play. And in China, they're going to be, there's some overlap, but they're going to be a little different, at least according to Hofstede's research. But you're absolutely right that this is really complicated when we think about our ideas and attitudes about disability, and how that overlaps with our expectations of sport. Yep, good comment. Yeah, Andy.
So how much of this might be because of the timing? And what I mean there is even the biggest Olympic fans, they've watched 17 straight days of that. They've gotten drunk on Olympic coverage, and then a couple of weeks later, it's kind of like the equivalent of a person running a marathon and then saying, okay, let's go out for a run.
Yep, no, you're exactly right.
So how do you feel about the timing
Yeah.
and the place of it?
Oh, yeah, and you could also argue, I mean, there've been discussions, and Brent, you've probably heard some of these, should we move the Paralympics in front of the Olympics? Would that help? Should we completely separate the Paralympics from the Olympics in terms of timing? You've also got the issue with media organizations. They've just spent a whole lot of money sending journalists to cover the Olympics, and then do media organizations want to reinvest in the Paralympics? Now, again, relatively speaking, the U.S. isn't doing it in other countries compared to other countries. But at the same time, that's another factor in this whole thing. Yeah. Now, do we think that the coverage would be a whole lot better if they were completely different time and venue? Not sure, but.
Well, let me follow up
Yeah,
with that then.
yeah.
You know, one U.S. specific reason that sometimes I'll hear is, you know, the Olympics typically are late July, early August. And basically, all those journalists then are coming straight home to cover our biggest sport in the country, football, which other countries don't have to deal with. So is it partly competition with football, which kind of blots out everything?
Yeah, I think that can be part of it. But I think, again, if it weren't football, I have a feeling it would be something else. Yeah. I will mention this, one thing that really, and I mentioned this just a bit at the beginning, but I want to mention it again. Something I was really, really happy about when we took our students to cover the Paralympics was the energy with which they approached the Paralympics, and the lack of sort of judgment about adapted sport that we know from previous research that sports journalists bring to it. In other words, previous research tells us that if you take a traditional sports journalist and you tell them to go cover the Paralympics, that they're going to bring a lot of biases to that, and they're not going to see adapted sports as quite authentic and sort of on equal footing. Students, we found, I didn't have to say anything to them. They simply approached all the athletes as authentic and really competitive and elite athletes. In fact, it was fun to see the way Tatiana McFadden, they thought she was a rock star. And so the coverage they were able to produce then was the kind of coverage that I thought was really kind of, in my mind, the kind of ideal coverage that we should see of this. So there are some cultural norms in sports departments, I think, at play here too. Yeah. I think the IPC really kind of, a light bulb went off with the IPC when they saw what the students were doing, so which was encouraging. Mark?
Did your group of students have multiple levels of abilities?
Yeah, they did. Yeah, they were mostly seniors. We'd kind of handpicked this group, but we did have some juniors and sophomores. Mm-hmm. So, but we didn't have to do as much coaching about the stereotypes that I was afraid they were going to bring into it. It was nice. They just weren't bringing those in, which was great. Yeah.
What gives you the passion for all this? I mean, where did it all start?
Yeah, that's a great question. Here's what I'm going to tell you. I've always been very passionate about women's sports and coverage of women's sports and equal opportunity for women. And I think if you're really passionate about that, you cannot ignore adapted and Paralympic sport, because ultimately the problems and the challenges that female athletes face, Paralympic athletes face the same thing. So as a good feminist sports researcher, I need to be looking at adapted sport. That's it. Yeah.
As a side genre of interest I have, I look at technology and information data flow. And one of the most interesting areas is the augmented body, where the neurological connection by which we have an electrical signal internally can actually operate with machinery as well. And there's this idea that wearable tech, like the Apple smartwatch, is an iteration of what will eventually be integrated into our body, or perhaps even closer to our body, like, say, contact lenses.
Okay.
There's some gender theory about this, I'm sure, but do you see any correlation of, say, men more readily adapting body augmentation to compete than, say, women? Or is there perhaps no kind of construct there that is observable yet?
I love the question. I have no answer, but talk about some interesting research possibilities there.
Do you think of prosthetics?
Yeah. I mean, there's all this fascinating, just the science around prosthetics now. what prosthetics can do now is just absolutely amazing. But I haven't attached gender to it. Interesting. Thank you for the idea. You got my wheels turning here.
Connections for you, perhaps, that might be fruitful.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Any other questions, comments, observations? Yeah,
Maria,
Andy.
I was wondering if you can go through some of those stereotypes that you're talking about.
Yep.
Because, with gender, we talk about stereotypes of diminishment. With race, sometimes it's the natural athlete versus the tenacious athlete. What are some of the, if you're saying we're trying to avoid stereotyping here, or certain types of stories, what are those?
Yeah, I would tell you the biggest stereotype that you see in sports coverage that you're always going to want to avoid with adapted sports athletes is what's called the super Crip stereotype. The super Crip stereotype is where you take, to me anyway, it's where you take the hero element that we know exists in good sports reporting, right? I mean, if you think about it, sports writing and sports reporting is always about the creation of heroes at the end of the day. What happens in adapted sport is oftentimes the athlete is positioned as heroic simply for living with a disability. And that's not fair to the athlete. And so oftentimes the coverage takes on a pitiful tone to it. And really the heroism is all about, is for that athlete with a disability is all about, again, simply existing. And the athlete has certainly gone way beyond that and is performing at really high levels. And that's what the heroism ought to be about, ultimately. So there you go. Yes?
Building on that, I may have missed this, but the Paralympic status of the athlete, does that mediate any of the cultural stereotype constructs that we see often in Olympic coverage? Some of the stuff Andy studied about, not even nationalism stuff, but kind of the robotic, mechanistic sort of tone for Cold War athletes or increasingly Chinese athletes. Is that mediated when we talk about Paralympic athletes?
Yes, it generally it is. That is, but as we see, I mean, I think that will change over time as we address some of the other issues we have with coverage of Paralympics. So I guess what I'm telling you is new issues will emerge, and those will probably be among them. But right now, the super Crip stereotype is the overarching issue we have. Non-coverage, and then that kind of coverage.